Like, one of the things I think about the game that it's like honestly very controversial, and if you think this is wrong, I don't think you're necessarily wrong to think it, is I think League of Legends should have assassins that just instantly kill you without much you can do about it. Like characters like Rengar and Talon, I think are actually very, very good for the game. Like, legitimately. I don't think they should be the best thing you can play all the time, but like, I think actually it's an important part of the game's ecosystem that there's a couple characters in it, like Rengar and Talon, that can say like, hey, if that squishy champion is getting out of line, I can jump up and show them who's boss. And of course, you know, they still need to be fair. They need to like actually have to succeed, and you can do things like, you know, run a Janna or something. But I generally think it's like good for the counter play and interest of the game that there are different classes with different strengths, and some classes get just annihilated by other classes. I think that's like generally good for League of Legends as a whole. And that's a fairly controversial take, and it might not be correct. There's definitely a version of League of Legends where like there's a lot less burst in the game, and more characters, the characters who can kill you like have to work for it harder, right? And like that also is potentially a very good version of the game. And so that's just like kind of like a illustration of like how I might think one way, and that doesn't necessarily mean that way is the right way to think about the game, or a perfect way to think about the game. Can I ask about TP versus Ignite lane? After the death timer changes, you get behind through killing your laner. I personally really dislike TP. I do not like that TP as a defensive summoner spell, you take it and you win your lane. I personally really dislike that. Because what happens with TP, especially with the death timer changes, is that if you all-in someone with Ignite and they have TP, you lose. Because they'll just TP back to lane, and then you lose your lane. Even though you killed them. So actually, personally, I really don't like what TP does to the meta in general, outside of like, you know, letting top laners participate things. And I think personally it's very messed up that taking TP gives you an advantage over people who take offensive summoner spells. Personally, not a fan of that. Kind of wish it wasn't that. Like, I don't know, spicy pitch. TP starts the game on cooldown. And so if you take TP, sorry. If you take TP and you die level 1, sorry, you deserved it, lose your lane, right? Like, to me, I feel like maybe that looks better. The hard part, though, is that TP is also, like, very, very important for especially top laners at high levels to play to, like, feel like they can, like, participate in the game. Because, you know, they're tasked with, like, split pushing and going to side lanes. They need some way to, like, get to a fight. So, like, TP, like, creates a lot of, like, very important things for the game, especially in regards to top lane. But it does come at this, like, really, I think, sad cost of, like, if you're taking an offensive summoner spell a lot of times in lane and your opponent has TP, like, you're actually trolling by trying to fight them, which I think is, like, pretty rough. But it's just not an easy solve because, again, like, top laners do need TP to, like, function to some degree. Why do we decrease death timer? Decrease death timer reduces snowballing. So we adjusted death timers to lower the power of getting early kills in lane. Because we wanted it to be less like, oh, I died level 1 or 2 in lane, therefore, you know, I lose the game, right? And so decreased early death timers reduces the ability of an opponent who kills you to snowball off of that kill. And for you to get behind, basically. Whether or not that's correct, that's a totally different story. But that is the reason to say do something like reduce a death timer.
Is SION going to get an update since they both have low pick weight and win rate? A character doesn't necessarily need an update because they have low pick rate. Actually, if a character has low pick rate and win rate, that can actually be a good thing because it means we can buff them, and perhaps that will cause their pick rate to increase. The issue with Swain is that we can't buff him per our balance framework. The issue with Swain is that we can't buff him per our balance framework. Our balance framework says that a character with a 52% win rate is someone you should avoid buffing. We don't like buffing characters that have this high of a win rate, regardless of how powerful they are and regardless of how they feel. We just don't like buffing characters with this win rate. And so one of the reasons we're thinking about Swain is that despite having a very high win rate, he's not very satisfying for a variety of reasons and doesn't feel powerful for a variety of reasons. That's SION being at a low win rate is a bit different. That said, I will say I think SION has gotten a lot worse in the new season. And I think over the years we've tuned out the unfair things about him. And I think he's a character that actually needs something unfair. Like, I don't think we can just look at SION and say, whenever SION is strong, he's doing something unfair. And then usually our solution to him being strong is nerfing the unfair thing. But like if you look at that guy's kit, everything it does is fair. And so if you don't make the character do something that's for them, they end up feeling like they don't have a lot of point to being played. So Scion, it's like his W is good, so we made it less useful for Scion. His passive was good, so we made it worse at taking towers. His E was good, so we removed the damage. It's just like a character who's based around that Q probably won't feel good, and it's not because Scion's Q is a bad spell or poorly designed. It's that Scion's Q is for his opponents, right? Like Scion's Q says, I'm going to stand here and look really threatening and then just walk out. And that's fine. That's a cool spell. Scion's Q is a very cool spell. But if that's his main output on a fight, is zoning people with his Q, he's not going to feel like a very powerful champion. And so if I look at Scion, I'd be like, I feel like maybe the W should be significantly less fair to play against, or the ultimate should be significantly less fair to play against, or the E should be much stronger in lane so he can poke you out. Like, he needs something that is for him. And if he doesn't have that, he'll probably end up being like falling out of popularity, unfortunately. That's my take on Scion, at least. I think one of the things that happened to Scion is we might have gone too far on his passive. I know, like, it's not a thing where it's like the guy should be inty, right? But I think maybe we oversolved on his passive. I think he is supposed to kill towers to some degree when he dies. So yeah, I don't know. Anyways, yeah, my take on Scion is that maybe we could make something about him a bit less fair. I think the W would be a good place to do it. I think if the W was a bit more in Scion's favor to, like, say, like, you know, prime and pop on you and deal damage, stuff like that, that might be something that feels good for him. But he and a lot of other health tanks have been feeling like somewhat off since the changes to things like Heartsteel. Do I think NASUS needs rework? No. NASUS is great. Incredible champion. Really well designed and works fine.
Dennis asks, considering the Swain's mid-scope goal was to make him good in solo lanes, do you think you guys succeeded in doing so, considering his strength is a 5v5, but his 1v1 is so bad it doesn't feel good to play? I think Swain's mid-scope was a great improvement to him, so I think there was a success there. I do think Swain has this eternal issue in that he doesn't feel functional against a lot of champions because of his E. So Swain right now, in terms of raw win rate, is powerful in solo lanes. That does not mean he feels powerful, I want to be very clear. But mid lane Swain, right now, has a 52.5% win rate in mid. The problem with this win rate is it means we can't buff him. That doesn't mean he's viable. I want to be very clear. This win rate does not mean he's a good solo laner. It doesn't mean he's a viable solo laner. But our balance strategy dictates that high win rate champions like this should not be buffed. And so from that context, it does feel like we have a champion who, despite winning a lot in mid, doesn't feel very powerful or popular there. And so I would unpack so while I do think the update made him a better laner and a better solo character who feels better to play, I do think there's just some core things about Swain that just make him hard to fit in that space. Like, as an example, I think Swain's E is a pretty rough spell. It generally feels like it's entirely in your opponent's hand to play around it, especially in melee range, which is weird because melee range is often where Swain wants to be. And so he has this spell that doesn't really synergize with what his kit wants to do very well, and at the same time it has a lot of counterplay that he feels that he can't play around, and only his opponent can play it around. Compare Swain's E to like a standard skill shot. And so I would say that, like, I'm not sure that Swain to this day is like the most viable feeling or powerful mid laner, but we're in a spot where I do think the mid-scope made him better, but we're still in a spot where he wins so much that we can't buff him, but people don't seem to think he's viable even though he's winning all that much. So it's rough. That said, literally right now, I think Swain just also needs a little bit of follow-up from the item changes. I think he's one of the characters that feels pretty bad about the item changes in a way that, like, he probably needs a little follow-up to, like, how he cares about mana and stuff. So yeah, that's the idea with Swain.